Hi, welcome to our discussion of Frankenstein, letters 1 through 4. Just a few things to point out in this section. I want to note that this is called an epistolary frame. Epistolary, think of the word epistle, meaning letter, and the story is framed by the novel. The entire novel is framed by these letters that Robert Walton is writing to his sister as he is exploring toward the North Pole. And of course, this is where he meets Victor. A few things to note in this section is that Mary Shelley uses this traditionally female form, this feminine form of the epistolary novel. It is traditionally associated with the feminine to tell her story. We also want to note that she does make reference to Rime of the Ancient Mariner, the poem by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. She grew up with Samuel Taylor Coleridge in her father's living room. Her father, of course, was William Godwin, and he had a literary salon, and that's where she met Percy Shelley and all of that. So she was familiar with Rime of the Ancient Mariner when she wrote this, and she was familiar with many great works of literature. She was a very educated woman. But we do want to mention that she does allude to the poem, which was first published in 1798. So that's something to keep in mind. You'll notice that she does not put years on the letters. She just puts July 7th, 17 blank, August 5th, 17 blank. So we're kind of left to our own devices to figure out when did this actually take place. And you know, that's a whole side issue that we're not going to get into now, of like looking at old calendars, and I've kind of done that research, but it's super cheesy and probably no one's interested but me. I want to point out in letter number 3, whenever Walton says, "What can stop the determined heart and resolved will of man?" Find that place in letter 3 and mark it. What can stop the determined heart and resolved will of man? It's one of the central questions of the novel, and it's something that we're going to be returning back to throughout the novel with all of the characters. So we want to keep in mind that Walton says this at the very beginning. What can stop the determined heart and resolved will of man? I also want to point out in this section that he calls the creature a demon or a daemon, depending on which particular version you're reading. This word demon means, or when it's spelled this way, D-A-E-M-O-N in a lot of translations, it means a guiding spirit, and it's between the gods or humans. So I think that's an interesting choice of words that she uses there as well. This is something that she changed between the 1818 and 1831 versions. I also want to point out the aloneness that Walton feels before he meets up with Frankenstein, before he finds Victor. How he feels so isolated from the rest of the men on the ship. He doesn't relate to them. He has no friend. And it's not until he finds this stranger on the ice, nearly dead, that he finds a friend to confide in and to talk to. I do want to point out in the letter that is dated August 13th, where the stranger, who we then come to find out is Victor, where Victor says, "We are unfashioned creatures, but half made up. If one wiser, better, dearer than ourselves, such a friend ought to be, do not lend his aid to perfectionate our weak and faulty natures." We want to mark this particular passage because we are going to revisit it later on after, really after chapter 4. We're going to revisit this sentiment that Victor has and that he expresses to Walton. I want to point out that the reason that Victor decides to tell this story is because he is afraid that Walton is going to follow in his footsteps, is desiring the same thing, that he will not give up at all in the pursuit of science, and that the pursuit of knowledge and science for the sake of science is the motivating force, and that Victor feels that there is something wrong with this. And so the novel is essentially a warning to Walton to not just pursue science for the sake of science, but to also give thought about really why is he doing what he's doing. So the novel is essentially a warning to Walton. Walton and Victor is telling the story to Walton. Walton is then recording the story and sharing it with his sister, who presumably is sharing it with us. So it's an interesting frame story, the way that these letters work. So keep that in mind too as we're going through, that this is almost like a third-hand account where Victor's telling the story to Walton, who's telling it to his sister, who's sharing it with us. All right, I think that's enough for letters 1 through 4 of just what I want to make sure that we point out. I'm going to do a separate video for chapters 1 through 4, and then there's a brief activity, a response activity that we'll share what we think. All right, thanks.